Like many Africans, I am frustrated by the way Africa and its people are presented in Western forms of media. Africans are always starving and dying and caught up in never-ending wars. But most Africans do not fulfill these stereotypes, and neither do most African countries. I am Waringa Kamau, and I am a student at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. I am a Kenyan, and I have been fortunate to have traveled across Africa. The Africa that I have grown to love and call home is beautiful, bursting with cultural diversity, and it has a very promising future. So I get very disappointed when these things that I love about Africa are deliberately omitted by Western media. Western media often give an unbalanced presentation of the continent. A lot of emphasis is placed on the negative side of Africa. I am on a mission to see what people in the West think about Africa based on what they see on their newspapers and on their TV screens. So I asked a couple of Washington and Lee students to tell me what came to their minds at the mention of Africa. Here's what I got.
They portray Africa as a place where there are starving children, and they always will need help, and they will always need money for food and education.
Whenever people talk about Africa, I just think of the savannah and like with a lot of animals running out like on that thing, and then the weather is like sunny and hot.
I guess the first thing that I think of is probably those commercials that have the starving children and the bones sticking out, and probably people in traditional African garb.
I think of mosquito nets, and I think of those commercials of children who are starving, and I think of people taking care of people who have AIDS.
What I think about the media trying to convey about Africa is they don't talk about much, just about the parts that are really negative about Africa and the scandals that they have. So for example, I think they talk a lot about poverty, about poor education, about HIV and malnourished children, and how all these are the definite aspects of Africa.
These stereotypical images are so dominant in media that Westerners believe what they see reflects the reality of Africa. Africans coming to the West have to deal with these stereotypes when they interact with their American peers. We feel as though we're supposed to look and act in certain ways that live up to the stereotypical images about us as is portrayed in Western media.
Freshman year, I met someone when, we just all got here and everyone was going out to parties and meeting other people, and I was dancing with this person, and then, we started talking, and he was asking me where I was from, and I said I was from Senegal. He's like, where is that? I said, it's in Africa. He's like, you're not African. What do you mean? Well, you don't dance like an African. So I felt obligated to have this conversation with him because I wanted to understand what dancing like an African meant. And he said, well, you just seem like a regular American. And it was, I didn't take any offense in it. It actually was just quite funny. But then it got me thinking afterwards, wow, well, why can't an African just dance like that? Why do I have to, I don't know, be that person who would probably strip and go, ooh? It was a little strange.
My university is in rural Virginia in a small town called Lexington. When I first came here, I had a really hard time adjusting to Lexington because it's a very tiny town. I shared this with a friend and I told him, I've never lived in such a small town before. I've never been in such a rural environment. Prior to that, I had shared with him that I'm from Kenya, and he looked at me and dismissed what I had said because, in his mind, I should be used to rural environments because the Africa that they show on Western media is a bunch of villages with mud huts. They never show you the big cities. I am a city girl and I have grown up in Nairobi and lived in Johannesburg, which quite honestly is like being in New York or Chicago or any other big city here in America. I talked to other Africans to find out if they've had similar experiences.
One time someone asked me if people in Nigeria lived in trees.
I was at a summer camp, and one of my counselors asked me, have you tasted zebra meat before? I was like, where's that coming from? I've had chicken just like you do. In another instance, one of my cousins came home from middle school, and this was when I was living in Virginia, and he told me his friend asked him if he has a spear at home. Those kind of questions. And sometimes when I'm speaking English, people are asking me, oh, you speak such good English. You must have been here for some time, implying that the only reason why you can speak good English is if you've been in the States for a long time. but we have good schools in Ghana, and that's why I learned most of my English. So,
well, coming from Uganda, I feel like a lot of people, when I introduce myself and I'm like, oh, I'm from Uganda, all they think about is, oh, Idi Amin. And that's not all about Uganda. There's a lot more.
Stories about Africans doing normal things like setting fashion trends and making progressive political policies do not receive much coverage. Instead, the media gravitates towards those stories that reiterate the narrative of Africa as the dark continent. Imagine if African media only told Africans of the shootings in Newtown, Chicago, and Virginia Tech, and that became the only story that Africans ever heard about America. Africa, just like the rest of the world, has its own set of challenges. However, these challenges are not the only story. The achievements of Africans ought to be shared too.
I like to see images of our dance, images of our cultural artifacts, images of our history. I like to see images of our technological advancement. I like to see images of children having fun, not children starving, not children so close to death, but children happy. I like to see images like that.
But why is it that these stories rarely make it on Western media?
It's boring. It's boring. People already have a certain kind of attitude and mindset about Africa and African affairs, and to have the media stray from that storyline is going to be disconcerting to people, and they won't believe it, or it's hard to break the mold, I think. And it's I think it is the responsibility of media sources to kind of own up to that and try to change that, but I think it's the nature of news.
Western media choose to air only the negative when Africa is a subject. And this might be because of commercialization of news. At the end of the day, they need to make money to stay in business.
War sells, like negative news sells, right? Somalia, everyone knows Somalia. Everyone knows Nigeria, Boko Haram, and all these famine and hunger and diseases. Those are the kinds of stories that grab headlines, that people always want to read about. And that makes it very difficult for journalists to go into Africa and provide a balanced reporting, because those stories that are a bit more balanced, that are less negative, do not really attract a big audience. So more often, these journalists would go into Africa just to pick on the negative headlines. For example, I've just been reading about the elections in Kenya, and everyone is trying to say, oh, there's going to be an outbreak of violence, and that is what people are really reading about. That's what people want to hear. Why are they not saying, no, Kenya has risen above that, there's not going to be any outbreak of violence, the election is going to be free, peaceful, and fair?
Africans have realized that they ought to tell their own stories. We have realized that we just can't sit and hope that maybe one day a more balanced picture will emerge. Africans, especially young people, are using social media to challenge stereotypical images that make headlines in the West. But this needs to happen more and on a greater scale. My dream is to contribute towards opening Africa's first cable news channel that empowers Africans to tell their own stories. African voices need to be heard. Africans need to tell stories that reflect their realities. And until Africa has its own continent-wide news outlet, we risk our stories never being told. We risk forever being the dark continent. This is why it is so important that Africa has a news outlet that disseminates stories by Africans in Africa to the rest of the world. Ultimately, Africa's media image is changing. The way Africa is portrayed in Western media has been gradually changing, but more needs to be done. And I believe that young Africans can contribute by being more vocal about their experiences and the great things that they are doing on the continent.